I believed I understood the limits of family, love, and betrayal. I was wrong. The envelope arrived early Tuesday morning. The paper inside was crisp and official, carrying the sharp scent of ink, and something far heavier. It hadn't come through the usual mail. A man in a dark uniform delivered it personally to the door of my apartment. His face was blank, his eyes sliding past mine as though I were already standing trial. When I read the words family court and petition for conservatorship printed in harsh black letters, the ground beneath me didn't just shift, it disappeared. They were asking a judge to declare me incompetent, my own parents. Before I go further, you need to understand where my life stood before that envelope appeared. I lived in a modest but bright one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, Chicago. I worked as a senior archivist at the Chicago History Museum, a job that didn't make me rich but gave my life meaning. My days were spent among old letters, faded photographs, and the quiet, dusty voices of people long gone. It was peaceful work. I liked the silence. Over the years, I had built a careful life, slowly, patiently. After a childhood that often felt like walking across a floor of already cracked eggshells. My parents, Patrick Foster and Natalie Foster, were experts at appearances. From the outside, our family looked flawless. A beautiful colonial house in Naperville, 2 luxury cars in the driveway, charity galas, country club memberships. My father was an equity partner at a respected law firm. My mother sat on charity boards and chaired committees. To the world, they were pillars of the community. Inside that house, the atmosphere was different. Thin, cold, measured. Love wasn't freely given, it was negotiated. Affection was something you earned through performance. My younger brother Lucas, 2 years behind me, understood the rules perfectly. He mirrored their ambitions, repeated their opinions, and was rewarded with their approval. I, on the other hand, was the defective version. Too quiet, too bookish, too satisfied with small things. I never wanted a corner office in a skyscraper. I wanted a quiet desk in a library. I didn't dream of networking at cocktail parties. I dreamed of deciphering the handwriting inside a century-old diary. To them, that wasn't just different. It was a flaw. The real breaking point came 8 years ago, when I was 25. I had just finished my master's degree in archival science. At what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner, my father slid a glossy brochure across the table. It advertised a business management program. "This is where you need to be, Adriana," he said in a tone that left no room for discussion. "This archive nonsense ends now. We've indulged this little hobby long enough." I looked toward my mother for support. She was studying her nails, a faintly disapproving smile resting on her lips. "Your father knows what's best for your future," she said without lifting her eyes. That night, I made the decision that would shape the rest of my life. I thanked them for dinner, went upstairs to my old bedroom, packed a single suitcase, and left. I didn't slam the door. I closed it quietly, finally realizing that the silence I walked into belonged to me. The years that followed were hard. I waited tables, shared cramped apartments with roommates, and saved every dollar I could. My job at the museum started at the very bottom, as an assistant, but it became my anchor. Slowly, patiently, I built a life. I paid off my student loans. I saved for a used car. I scraped together enough money for the down payment on my apartment. There was no trust fund waiting for me, no hidden safety net. It was just me. And as difficult as it was, it became the most rewarding thing I had ever done. After I left home, contact with my parents was rare. Occasional stiff phone calls on birthdays or holidays. To them, my independence was simply a phase, a stubborn rebellion they believed I would eventually grow out of. When I finally bought my apartment, my mother's only comment was, "I hope the neighborhood is safe." They never came to see it. They had no idea what my home looked like, what filled it, or what it meant to me. All they knew was that it belonged to me. And in their world, that meant something dangerous. It meant something they couldn't control. So when the court notice arrived, it wasn't entirely shocking. It was simply the most extreme move they could make, The nuclear option I had always feared but never truly believed they would use. A conservatorship. They were asking the court to declare that I, a 33-year-old woman with steady employment, excellent credit, and a fully paid-off home, was incapable of managing my own life. They wanted authority over everything. My finances, my property, my decisions. The petition described me as financially immature and emotionally unstable, claiming I was putting myself at serious risk. Their evidence consisted of a list of my life choices: my career, my independence, my refusal to pursue a more profitable path. According to them, I was isolated, easily manipulated, careless with my future. My hands trembled as I read the document. Their attorney, Gregory Hale, a senior partner from my father's own firm, had filed the petition. I could almost hear my father's voice hidden inside the legal language. Imagine my mother nodding approvingly beside him. They expected me to panic. They expected me to collapse under the weight of it. For a moment, staring down at that paper, I almost did. Old feelings rushed back, years of doubt, of being told I wasn't enough. But then I looked around my living room. At the bookshelf I had built with my own hands, filled with novels and history texts. At the peace lily on the window, a plant I had raised from a tiny cutting. This was my life. I had built it piece by piece, and I refused to let them tear it down simply because they didn't understand its design. I drew in a long, steady breath. The panic slowly hardened into something colder, something sharper. Resolve. I wasn't the frightened girl who had walked out of their house 8 years earlier. I wasn't that frightened girl anymore. I was a woman who had fought for every good thing in her life. And I was ready to prove that the quiet daughter my parents had always underestimated had spent years watching, learning, and preparing for exactly this kind of fight. I picked up my phone. It was time to hire a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. I called Elena Castillo. You may not recognize her name, but in certain legal circles, she's almost legendary. Her specialty is defending people when power tries to strip away their independence. Cases involving financial exploitation, abusive guardianships, and families attempting to control someone else's life through the courts. Years earlier, I had read an article about her. It described a young artist whose parents had tried to seize control of her inheritance. Elena had dismantled their case piece by piece with ruthless precision. Something about that story had stayed with me. I had saved the article, half on instinct, thinking that one day I might need it. It turned out that instinct had been right. Her office was located downtown in the Loop, inside a sleek modern building of glass and steel, so different from the dark wood-paneled corridors of my father's firm that the contrast alone felt symbolic. The receptionist led me into a corner office overlooking the Chicago River. Elena stood as I entered. She looked to be in her early 50s, with sharp gray eyes and a no-nonsense cut of dark hair. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry except a slim watch. She didn't smile, but her handshake was firm, and her gaze studied me carefully. "Adriana Foster," she said, motioning toward the chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed the petition. Your parents aren't bluffing. This is a serious and aggressive move." "I know," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "They don't bluff, they win." A faint flash of approval crossed her eyes. "Good," she said. "At least you understand the battlefield. Now I need the full story. Not just the petition, everything. Your parents, your childhood, every conversation, every financial interaction, every favor with strings attached since you were born. Don't leave anything out." So I talked. For 2 straight hours. I told her about the conditional praise, the competitions my parents quietly orchestrated between me and Lucas, the way money was always used as leverage. I told her about the time they borrowed from my childhood savings account for what they called an emergency, which later turned out to be a luxury vacation. I told her about the dinner where my father demanded I abandon my career, about the silent treatment that followed when I refused, about the 8 years of cold, distant peace after I moved out. I described my work at the Chicago History Museum, my apartment, my car, the quiet life I had built for myself. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down brief notes. Her attention never drifted. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "They're framing this as concern," she said calmly. "The fragile daughter with the impractical job who supposedly can't manage money. It's a classic strategy." She folded her hands together. "To defeat it, we need two things. First, we prove that you are the opposite of incompetent. We'll bring testimony from your employer, colleagues, and your bank manager. We'll show 10 years of financial discipline and stability." She paused. "Second, and this part is critical, we show that their motive isn't concern, it's control, possibly greed." She studied me carefully. "Do your parents have financial problems?" I blinked. "I honestly don't know. They've always lived well. The house, the cars, the vacations." Elena nodded slowly. "Luxury lifestyles can be illusions," she said. "Investigating their finances will be our first step. If they're under pressure, this conservatorship could be their escape route. Liquidating your assets might solve a lot of problems for them." The thought made my stomach twist. "But suspicion alone isn't enough," she continued. "We need a pattern. Have they ever tried to access your finances before? Asked you for money since you became independent?" I thought carefully. "No, not directly. But about 6 months ago, my father called. That was unusual. He asked whether I had a financial advisor, whether my investments were diversified. He even offered to recommend someone from his firm to review my portfolio. And I told him I had it handled. And he didn't like that? He sounded irritated. He said, 'You always think you have everything handled, Adriana.' Then the call ended." Elena's eyes sharpened. "That's a probe," she said. "They were testing your vulnerability." She leaned forward. "The hearing is scheduled in 3 weeks. We'll file a strong objection immediately, but we should assume they have other strategies prepared. Witnesses. Possibly a doctor willing to give a questionable psychological opinion. Maybe even family friends claiming they're concerned." Then her tone changed slightly. "But there's something else you need to prepare for." "What?" "The emotional warfare." She spoke carefully. "In that courtroom, they won't act like your parents. They'll act like plaintiffs. They'll speak about you as if you're incapable of managing your own life. Your mother may cry. Your father will sound calm and reasonable, the kind of calm that makes anyone who challenges him look irrational." She held my gaze. "You cannot react. No anger, no tears. You sit there quietly and appear composed and competent. Your reaction will become part of the evidence." She paused. "Can you do that?" For a moment, I pictured their faces, my mother's permanent expression of disappointment, my father's controlled impatience. I also remembered the little girl I used to be, hiding in a closet so no one would see her crying. That girl was gone. "Yes," I said. "I can do that." "Good." Elena stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll have my investigator begin immediately. In the meantime, you continue your life as usual. Don't contact your parents. If they reach out, direct them to me." Her eyes hardened slightly. "This is a war now, Adriana, and the first rule of war is simple. Never let the enemy see you sweat." I left her office feeling both terrified and strangely energized. For the first time since the envelope arrived, I realized something important. I had a general now. I wasn't fighting alone. From there, I went straight back to the Chicago History Museum, burying myself in the comforting scent of old paper and aging documents. My boss, Margaret Holloway, took one look at my face and immediately closed the door to her office. "Well," she said, "out with it." When I explained the situation, her reaction was instant. "The absolute gall," she muttered, eyes blazing. "You're one of the most capable, level-headed people I know. Your work is meticulous. I don't care about your finances, but you've never even been late paying your share of the coffee fund in 10 years. She leaned forward. "They want a fight? Then we'll give them one. You have my full support. Testimony, references, whatever you need." Her confidence steadied me. Over the following days, while Elena's investigators worked quietly in the background, I focused on gathering the facts. I collected bank statements, tax returns, mortgage records, employment documentation. I mapped out the timeline of my adult life. Every payment made, Every milestone reached. Every piece of evidence proving that my independence wasn't a mistake. It was a life I had built deliberately. A ledger of freedom. Every bill I had paid, every step forward in my career, every small moment of peace inside my apartment became another stone in the fortress I had built around my independence. Then, 1 week before the hearing, Elena Castillo called. Her voice carried a tight edge of excitement. "Adriana," she said, "we found something." Their investigator had begun digging into my parents' financial records. The beautiful colonial house in Naperville, the one that had always symbolized their success, had been refinanced 3 separate times within the last 5 years. On top of that, there were 2 liens filed against the property for unpaid contractor work. Their investment portfolio, Elena explained, was riddled with failed high-risk ventures. Then she paused. "And there's more. A malpractice lawsuit has been filed against your father's firm. A serious one. If it goes badly, his partnership could be in danger." For a moment the pieces snapped together with chilling clarity. This wasn't simply about control, it was about survival. Their survival. My apartment, my savings, my car. Everything I owned, they had seen it as a life raft. They weren't trying to protect me from myself. They were trying to save themselves by drowning me. "This changes everything," Elena said calmly. "But we have to be careful. We can't reveal that we know any of this yet. It's our ace in the hole." Her strategy was simple. Let them commit fully to their story first. "Let them present the image of the unstable daughter who can't manage her life," she said. "Let them lock themselves into that narrative. Then we dismantle it and reveal the truth about their financial desperation." Judges don't look kindly on petitioners acting in bad faith. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I stood in my living room running my fingers along the spines of my books, studying the framed prints I had picked up from street fairs over the years, reminding myself that the walls around me were real. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. A reckoning between the girl I had once been, the woman I had become, and the parents who had never seen me as anything more than a reflection of their own ambitions, or a tool to be used when convenient. The next morning I dressed carefully. A tailored navy dress, nothing flashy, no ornamentation, just quiet professionalism. I looked exactly like what I was, a competent, responsible adult. When I met Elena in the lobby of the Cook County Circuit Court, she gave me a quick once-over and nodded with quiet approval. "Remember," she whispered, "they're the performance. You're the truth." Ahead of us, the heavy doors of the courtroom waited. Inside, the room felt smaller than I had imagined, and far quieter. The air carried the faint scent of lemon polish and old tension. At the front, the judge's bench loomed like a dark slab of carved wood. To the left sat the plaintiff's table. My parents were already there. My father, Patrick Foster, wore the same immaculate suit he reserved for major legal arguments. He looked exactly as he always had, composed, dignified, the picture of a respected patriarch. My mother, Natalie Foster, sat beside him in a cream-colored suit, posture perfect, hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked as if she had arrived for a charity luncheon, not a hearing designed to strip her daughter of her rights. Between them sat their attorney, Gregory Hale, calmly reviewing his notes with a satisfied expression. He didn't even glance up when we entered. Elena led me to the defense table on the opposite side of the room. The distance between us and them felt enormous. We were sitting in the same courtroom, but it felt as though we existed in entirely separate worlds. I placed my hands flat on the cool wooden table, forcing them to remain steady. Following Elena's advice, I never looked toward my parents. Instead, I fixed my attention straight ahead, at the empty judge's bench and the state seal mounted high on the wall. I studied the room's details to steady myself. A scuff mark on the floor, the narrow windows letting in pale morning light. Then the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Daniel Mercer entered moments later. He was an older man with tired but sharp eyes that quickly surveyed the room before he settled into his chair. The hearing began. Gregory Hale rose first. His voice was smooth, controlled, almost soothing. "Your Honor," he began. "This is an extremely painful day for my clients, Patrick and Natalie Foster. They come before this court motivated by nothing but deep love and concern for their only daughter, Adriana." His words began painting a picture, a carefully constructed one. In his version of reality, I was a fragile dreamer who had never truly grown up. He described my quiet nature as emotional instability, my career as a dead-end path, my independence as isolation from the family that supposedly loved me. My small apartment became, in his telling, a hermit's retreat. My careful financial habits were framed as irrational hoarding. "We fear," Hale said with carefully measured reluctance, "that Miss Foster lacks the ability to recognize her own limitations. She is vulnerable to exploitation and is making decisions that could eventually lead to financial and personal disaster." He paused briefly before delivering the final line. "My clients seek only to protect her, to guide her, and ensure her long-term stability through a limited conservatorship." Then he called my mother to the witness stand. Watching Natalie Foster walk forward, her heels tapping softly against the floor, felt like witnessing a masterclass in performance. She took the oath, and Gregory Hale began his questions gently, guiding her into the role she had clearly rehearsed. "Natalie, can you describe your daughter's behavior growing up?" My mother's voice was gentle, touched with just enough tremor to sound sincere. "Adriana was always sensitive," she said softly. "A lovely child, but very much in her own world. While other children were playing sports or joining clubs, she would be alone in her room with her books. We tried to encourage her, to bring her out of that shell, but she resisted." She dabbed lightly at the corner of her eye with a tissue. "We've been so worried, especially these last few years. She's cut us out of her life, she refuses our help, and when we hear about how she's living now, that tiny apartment, that job with no future, it breaks our hearts." Her voice faltered delicately. "We just want to help her before it's too late." Across the table, Elena Castillo scribbled something quietly on her legal pad. She didn't interrupt. She was allowing them to build their narrative. Gregory Hale guided my mother through a carefully crafted sequence of memories, each one selected to make me appear impractical. The birthday when I spent my money on a collection of historical novels instead of putting it into savings. The time I chose to study art history rather than pre-law. The hiking trip with friends I once chose over attending a family networking event. Each story became another thread woven into their portrait of my supposed incompetence. My mother played the role flawlessly, the worried parent burdened with a difficult child. It was a performance she had been perfecting for 33 years. Then it was Elena's turn. She rose slowly for cross-examination, calm and deliberate. "Mrs. Foster," she began evenly, "you've described your daughter as financially immature. When was the last time you actually reviewed her financial records?" My mother blinked. "Well, we haven't. Adriana refuses to share them with us. That's part of the problem." "So your concern," Elena said smoothly, "is not based on evidence of debt or mismanagement, but rather on her career choices and her decision to live independently." "It's based on a pattern of poor judgment," my mother replied, her voice tightening. "A pattern," Elena continued, "that includes graduating with honors, earning a master's degree, maintaining steady employment for 10 years, and purchasing her own home without financial assistance from you or your husband. Is that correct?" My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Anyone can get a mortgage," she said stiffly. "That doesn't mean they can manage the responsibility." "But she has managed it," Elena replied calmly, "for 5 years, without a single late payment." She allowed the statement to linger before continuing. "You also mentioned isolation. Does your daughter have friends? A support system outside the family?" "She has acquaintances from work," my mother said dismissively, "but no real support. No one who truly looks out for her." Elena turned slightly toward the bench. "Your Honor, the defense will present testimony from several of those acquaintances, including her employer of 10 years, who will attest to Miss Foster's strong character and meaningful relationships within her community." Then she looked back at my mother. "Mrs. Foster, if your daughter were to marry tomorrow, would you still believe she required a conservator?" The question visibly caught her off guard. That would be different, she said. A husband would provide guidance. So in your view, Elena said quietly, the real issue is that she doesn't currently have a man managing her affairs. Objection, Hale snapped. Sustained, Judge Daniel Mercer said, though his attention remained fixed on my mother. Elena inclined her head slightly, withdrawn. Then she asked one final question. Mrs. Foster, do you love your daughter? For the briefest second, my mother's carefully maintained expression slipped, revealing pure irritation at the question. Of course I do, she said quickly. That's why we're here. Thank you, Elena said. No further questions. My father was called next. Hale shifted his tone, appealing to my father's identity as a lawyer and rational decision-maker. Patrick spoke about fiduciary responsibility and financial prudence. He described my life as a series of sentimental decisions unchecked by logic. According to him, my refusal to follow their advice wasn't independence, it was financial stubbornness. He was colder than my mother, more analytical, but the message remained identical. Adriana Foster, in their telling, was a child in an adult's body, and responsible adults had to intervene. When Elena stood for cross-examination, the room seemed to grow noticeably colder. Mr. Foster, she began, you are an equity partner at Foster and Hale LLP, correct? Yes. A firm specializing in corporate and property law? That's correct. So you are quite familiar with concepts such as liens, refinancing, and asset management. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. I am. Elena nodded. Your home in Naperville is quite beautiful. How many times have you refinanced that property in the past 5 years? Hale shot to his feet. Objection. Relevance. Judge Mercer looked toward Elena. Counselor? It goes directly to the petitioner's credibility and motive, Your Honor, she replied calmly. Their financial stability is relevant to their claim that they are acting solely out of concern. The judge considered briefly. I'll allow it, but proceed carefully. My father's jaw tightened. I'd have to check the exact number. Would 3 times be accurate? Elena asked. A faint flush crept up his neck. That sounds possible. The market has been volatile. And the 2 contractor liens currently filed against the property, are those also the result of market volatility? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. My mother sat completely still. Hale looked furious, and for the first time that day, I saw a crack in my father's composure. Not fear, rage. The fury of a man realizing his strategy had been exposed. I handle my personal affairs competently, he said, voice low and controlled. Unlike your daughter, Elena replied calmly, whom you claim cannot handle hers. Then she closed her folder. No further questions, Your Honor. She sat down. The damage wasn't devastating yet, but doubt had been planted. Judge Mercer wrote something slowly in his notebook. The hearing continued. Hale called a family friend who repeated my parents' concerns. Then a psychiatrist hired by them testified vaguely about attachment issues and the possibility of financial naivete, based entirely on interviews with my parents. Elena dismantled him within minutes by getting him to admit he had never met me. Then it was our turn. Elena called Margaret Holloway. My boss was unstoppable. She didn't just describe my competence, she spoke about my integrity, my reliability, the quiet leadership I provided within the archive department. She's the backbone of our archival team, Margaret said firmly. We trust her with historical documents that cannot be replaced. Then she looked directly at the judge. If Adriana Foster is incompetent, she said evenly, then so is everyone else in this room. Next came Thomas Keegan, the manager from my bank, who summarized my financial records, steady savings, excellent credit, and no debt beyond my mortgage. Then 2 women from my book club testified about our friendship, about dinners at my apartment, about my generosity, about the stability of my life. With each witness, the image of who I really was grew clearer, a responsible, grounded adult. It stood in stark contrast to the helpless figure my parents had tried to invent. Finally, As the afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows, Elena spoke again. Your Honor, the defense calls Adriana Foster. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the moment. I walked to the witness stand, steady and calm, and swore the oath. I didn't look toward my parents. Instead, I focused on Elena. She was my anchor. Her questions were simple and direct. She walked me through my education, my career, the purchase of my apartment. She asked me to explain my work. I spoke clearly. And as I described the mission of preserving letters, photographs, and forgotten stories, of protecting pieces of history that might otherwise disappear, my voice grew stronger. It wasn't a dead-end job, it was a life with purpose. I spoke about my life, my daily routines, my friendships, the careful way I planned my finances. None of it sounded dramatic. It was ordinary, methodical, almost boring. And that was exactly the point. My life was stable, predictable, completely, unmistakably sane. When I finished answering Elena's questions, she stepped toward the bench. Your Honor, she said, the defense would like to submit a comprehensive inventory of the respondent's assets and possessions prepared specifically for this proceeding to be entered into the record. Judge Mercer nodded. Proceed. Elena handed a thick, bound folder to the bailiff, a serious man in his 50s. He stepped forward and opened it. I will read the list into the record, he announced in a steady official tone. Then he began. Item 1, Primary Residence, Condominium Unit 4B, 321 Cedar Lane, with substantial equity in the property. Estimated market value, approximately $420,000. My father's eyes flickered. They hadn't known the condo was fully paid off. Item 2, Diversified Retirement and Investment Portfolio. Current value approximately $220,000. My mother's hand moved slowly to her throat. The bailiff continued in the same calm, methodical voice. Item 3. Private collection of rare first edition historical texts and personal journals acquired over a 10-year period. Many of these pieces were purchased cheaply from estate sales and overlooked auctions long before their historical value was widely recognized. Most recent professional appraisal estimates value at approximately $1,500,000. The reaction in the courtroom wasn't loud. It was a collective intake of breath. My father's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with unmistakable shock. Judge Mercer, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly leaned forward. At the plaintiff's table, Gregory Hale's confident smile vanished. The bailiff, unaware of the seismic effect of his words, prepared to continue. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. The number seemed to hang in the air, $1,500,000. Then chaos erupted. Your Honor! Hale shouted, jumping to his feet so abruptly his chair scraped loudly across the floor. This is outrageous. This is clearly some kind of stunt. My father was staring at me in disbelief. What is this? He demanded, his voice cutting sharply through the room. He wasn't speaking to the judge. He was speaking to me. The mask of the calm, concerned patriarch had vanished. In its place was something far more revealing, raw shock. What collection? He demanded. What journals? My mother looked equally confused, her carefully rehearsed composure shattered. Adriana, what is he talking about? Judge Mercer slammed his gavel. Order. Silence in this courtroom. The sharp crack restored a strained quiet. The judge's eyes moved slowly, from the bailiff's folder, to Elena, then to me, and finally to my stunned parents and their lawyer. There was unmistakable curiosity in his expression. Bailiff, he said calmly. Continue, slowly. The bailiff cleared his throat and resumed. Item 4. One vintage 1965 Ford Mustang Fastback, fully restored, stored in a private garage facility. Insured value approximately $180,000. Another wave of shock passed across my parents' faces. My father gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The Mustang was my secret pleasure, a restoration project I had worked on for years with a retired mechanic. I paid for every part myself, saving slowly until it was finished. It was kept in a rented garage in Westtown, My parents thought I drove a practical sedan. I did. The Mustang was for Sundays. The bailiff continued. Item 5. Assorted historical artifacts and antique maps acquired through licensed dealers and estate auctions. Estimated insured value approximately $300,000. Another pause. Item 6. Municipal and corporate bond portfolio. Estimated value approximately $400,000. Item 7. Liquid savings and checking accounts. Total balance approximately $150,000. Then he closed the folder. The numbers lingered in the air. The quiet, modest life my parents believed I lived, my supposedly impractical choices, added up to a net worth of nearly $3 million. All of it built slowly, quietly, while they assumed I was barely managing. Judge Mercer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Ms. Castillo, he said calmly, would you care to explain? Elena rose without a trace of hesitation. Certainly, Your Honor. What you have just heard is a verified inventory of my client's assets prepared by a licensed, court-approved appraiser and financial auditor. Every item listed is fully documented, insured, and legally owned by Adriana Foster. She paused briefly. The rare book and journal collection represents more than a decade of careful curation. Miss Foster is recognized in certain academic circles for identifying valuable primary historical sources. Several items in her collection have already been loaned to university archives for research purposes. She glanced briefly toward my parents. This is not a hobby. It is a scholarly endeavor with both historical and financial significance. Then she addressed the court again. This inventory demonstrates several things beyond dispute. First, that Adriana Foster is not financially incompetent, but in fact remarkably disciplined and sophisticated in managing her resources. Second, the petitioner's claim of financial immaturity is not merely incorrect. It is a profound misrepresentation. And third, she let the silence stretch. It raises an unavoidable question of motive. Her eyes shifted toward the plaintiff's table. Why would two individuals currently facing serious financial pressure attempt to seize control of the assets of a daughter who has clearly demonstrated exceptional financial responsibility? Hale jumped to his feet again. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. A last-minute ambush. We had no knowledge of these alleged assets. If they exist, which I strongly question, their origin and valuation should be investigated. The documentation is impeccable, Counselor, Elena replied smoothly, and your lack of knowledge is precisely the point. She faced the judge. The petition before this court was filed based on assumptions and deliberate ignorance. The petitioners believed that because they had chosen not to understand their daughter's life, there was nothing to understand. She paused. They were mistaken. Judge Mercer raised a hand. Mr. Hale, sit down, Miss Castillo. Your client may step down for a moment. Then he looked directly at me. Miss Foster, is this your signature on the authentication documents for this inventory? He held up the paper the bailiff had just handed him. I glanced at it. Yes, Your Honor. And you affirm, under penalty of perjury, that this inventory is accurate and complete to the best of your knowledge? I do, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. Then his gaze shifted toward my parents. The composure they had displayed earlier was gone. My father looked livid. My mother looked pale and bewildered. The performance was finished. Now only the truth remained. Mr. and Mrs. Foster, the judge said gravely, your petition is based on the claim that your daughter is incapable of managing assets of substantial value. He gestured toward the document. The court has just been presented with evidence that she has not only managed such assets, but accumulated them independently. Furthermore, it appears she did so while you remained completely unaware of their existence. He paused. That significantly undermines your credibility as petitioners. My father finally spoke again, the lawyer in him fighting through the shock. Your Honor, if these assets are legitimate, that only increases our concern. Wealth of that magnitude in the hands of someone with no experience managing it makes her vulnerable to fraud, manipulation, exploitation. He gestured toward me. She's been hiding this from her own family. That secrecy alone raises serious concerns. Or, the judge said dryly, it raises the possibility of self-preservation. Then he looked back at Elena. Ms. Castillo, earlier you referenced financial pressures on the petitioners. Please elaborate. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. She opened another folder. Your Honor, we have obtained publicly filed financial records indicating that the Foster residence in Naperville is heavily leveraged, with multiple liens currently attached. She handed copies to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge and to a now visibly shaken Gregory Hale. We also have documentation showing several high-risk investments that failed within the last 18 months. She paused. But most significant is this. She lifted another document. A malpractice lawsuit recently filed against Foster and Hale LLP. The claim seeks damages exceeding $5 million and directly threatens Mr. Foster's partnership and personal assets. The words landed with quiet precision. Elena continued calmly. Under those circumstances, gaining control over a daughter whose assets now exceed $2.5 million would represent extremely convenient timing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The implication was devastating. My mother let out a small choking sound. That's not why we... But the protest died before it could finish. The air in the courtroom had grown too heavy for lies. Judge Mercer studied the documents in front of him, then looked slowly from my parents to me. Gregory Hale made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, I move that this inventory be excluded from the record as prejudicial and irrelevant. My client's financial circumstances have no bearing on their legitimate concerns for their daughter. The judge's voice turned cold. It has every bearing, Counselor. He leaned forward slightly. It speaks directly to bias and potential bad faith. He tapped the documents. The petition for conservatorship is built upon a premise that has now been thoroughly disproven. Miss Foster is not incapable. In fact, the evidence suggests she is highly capable. He looked toward my parents. The petitioner's stated concern is contradicted by their own ignorance of their daughter's life and by the financial incentives now placed before this court. He drew a slow breath. I have seen enough. The petition for conservatorship is... He never finished the sentence. My father suddenly shot to his feet. You deceitful little... he shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. You hid all this from us. After everything we gave you, you owe us. The words echoed across the courtroom. They were raw, ugly, and completely honest. The mask was gone. The entitlement underneath had finally surfaced. My mother gasped. Patrick! But it was too late. Judge Mercer's expression turned icy. Bailiff, he said sharply, stop this immediately. Get security in here now. The command cut through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, my father stood frozen, his face flushed with rage and sudden realization. The professional image he had built his entire life hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. The courtroom doors swung open, and two uniformed officers entered quickly, positioning themselves between our table and my parents. The bailiff stepped closer to the bench in a protective stance. Judge Mercer no longer looked like a tired judge. Now he looked formidable. Mr. Foster, he said quietly, you will sit down. You will remain silent. If there is another outburst, I will have you removed from this courtroom and held in contempt. Do you understand? My father's chest rose and fell heavily. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but the sight of the officers and the unmistakable authority in the judge's voice finally broke through his anger. He sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped. Suddenly, he looked much older. The performance hadn't just ended. The actor had been dragged off the stage. Judge Mercer then turned to Gregory Hale. Counselor, he said calmly, control your client, or I will. Yes, Your Honor, Hale muttered, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Silence returned to the courtroom. The judge allowed it to stretch, letting the gravity of the moment settle over everyone present. Then he looked down again at the documents before him. My asset inventory on one side, and the evidence of my parents' financial desperation on the other. Judge Mercer finally spoke. His voice was steady, each word deliberate. What has been presented in this hearing today, he began, is one of the starkest contrasts I have ever witnessed in this courtroom. He gestured slightly toward the documents in front of him. On one side, we have a petition alleging incapacity, based largely on speculation, prejudice, and a striking lack of knowledge about the respondent's life. On the other, we have clear documentation demonstrating not merely competence, but remarkable discipline, financial judgment, and long-term success. Then he looked directly at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Foster, you asked this court to believe that your actions were motivated purely by concern for your daughter's well-being. The evidence presented today suggests something very different. His gaze sharpened. Your ignorance of your daughter's life appears to be willful. Your own financial circumstances create a clear alternative motive for seeking control of her assets. He paused briefly, glancing toward my father. And your reaction here today reveals a level of entitlement entirely inconsistent with the role of a protector. My mother began crying then, real crying this time, not the delicate, practiced tears from earlier. Her shoulders shook with harsh, silent sobs. They were the tears of exposure. The tears of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse. Judge Mercer continued, "The petition for conservatorship is denied." He paused. "Dismissed with prejudice." The phrase landed like a hammer. With prejudice meant the case was permanently closed. They could never bring the same petition again. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned toward Elena. "Ms. Castillo, you have raised serious concerns regarding the conduct of the petitioners. Filing a frivolous or malicious conservatorship petition is a serious matter. It misuses the authority of this court and can cause profound harm to the individual targeted." Then he looked back at my parents. "I am ordering a formal inquiry into whether this petition was filed in bad faith. The court will examine the timing of the filing, the allegations made, and the motivations behind them." He folded his hands. "If misconduct is confirmed, sanctions may follow." My father lowered his head into his hands. Sanctions. A formal judicial inquiry. Combined with the malpractice lawsuit already hanging over him, this could destroy more than his finances. It could end his career. Finally, Judge Mercer looked toward me. For the first time, his expression softened slightly. "Miss Foster, the court regrets the ordeal you have been forced to endure. You have demonstrated that you are a woman of considerable ability and character." He gave a small nod. "You are free to leave this courtroom with the court's full confidence that you are entirely capable of managing your own life." Then he lifted the gavel. "This case is closed." The sharp crack echoed through the room. Just like that, it was over. The moments afterward felt strangely unreal. The judge left the bench. The security officers lingered near the door to ensure the exit remained calm. Elena quietly began organizing her papers. I stayed seated, my hands still resting flat against the table, trying to absorb the sudden silence. The war was over. Not just won, decisively won. Across the room, tension simmered at my parents' table. Gregory Hale leaned toward my father, whispering harshly, "I told you to stay calm. What were you thinking?" My father said nothing. He stared down at the wooden tabletop as though it might explain where everything had gone wrong. My mother rummaged nervously through her purse, avoiding every gaze in the room. Elena gently touched my arm. "Let's go, Adriana," she said quietly. "Don't look at them. Don't say anything. Just walk out." I stood. My legs felt oddly detached from my body, but they held steady as I followed her toward the doors. As we passed their table, I couldn't stop myself from glancing over. My father looked up. Our eyes met. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something hollow, something defeated. For the first time in his life, he seemed to see me clearly, not as the disappointing daughter he believed he controlled, but as someone entirely beyond his reach, someone he had underestimated. That realization shattered something in his expression. My mother looked up as well. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her face crumpling with desperation. "Adriana, please," she whispered. I didn't slow down. I didn't answer. I walked out of the courtroom behind Elena, through the heavy doors and into the bright hallway of the courthouse. The contrast felt surreal. People moved past us talking about lunch plans, traffic, and other cases. Life continued. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. I stepped onto the courthouse steps and took a deep breath. Real air, free air. It was over. Elena turned toward me, and for the first time since we met, a genuine smile appeared. "You were perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. They never saw it coming." "The collection," I began, my voice rough from hours of silence. "When you told me to have everything appraised, I didn't realize it would become—" "The silver bullet?" she finished. She nodded. "You built that collection through discipline. Your eye recognized value. Your patience allowed it to grow. That wasn't luck. It was proof." She rested a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You didn't just manage your finances, Adriana. You built something meaningful, something they were too blind to recognize." Then she stepped back. "Go home, get some rest. The inquiry into their conduct will move forward, but that's my responsibility now." Her smile softened. "You're free, truly free." I nodded, overwhelmed. "Thank you, Elena, for everything." "You earned this," she said simply. Then she turned and walked back toward the courthouse doors, like a general returning from a battlefield after a decisive victory. I remained on the courthouse steps for a long time, standing quietly in the sunlight. The adrenaline slowly drained from my body, leaving behind a deep, trembling exhaustion. But beneath that exhaustion, something else began to take shape. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet, seismic sense of peace. The judge's ruling had been more than a legal victory. It was a declaration spoken from the authority of the court itself. You are capable, you are whole, you are free. The cage my parents had tried to build around me, made from their doubts, their expectations, their need for control, had not simply been unlocked. It had been exposed as something that never truly existed. I had never been trapped inside it. They were the ones imprisoned by their own illusions. Instead of driving straight home, I steered my sedan across town to the rented garage unit. I unlocked the door and rolled it open. There she was. Under a soft cover sat my 1965 Ford Mustang, painted a deep forest green. I pulled the cover away slowly and stood there for a moment, simply looking at her. This, too, was a part of my life they had never known about. A secret joy. A project built through patience, persistence, and quiet passion. I ran my hand gently across the smooth chrome bumper. For the first time since that envelope had arrived, I smiled. Not a triumphant smile, a small, private, genuine one. Then I covered the car again, climbed back into my sensible sedan, and drove home. Home to my apartment. Home to my life. The days after the hearing passed in a strange kind of silence. For years, it felt as though there had been a constant background noise in my life, an invisible pressure humming beneath everything. Now that noise was gone. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I returned to work at the Chicago History Museum the following Monday. Margaret Holloway took one look at me, handed me a mug of brutally strong tea, and said, "Don't even think about thanking me. Just get back to cataloging the Henderson letters. They're a disaster." It was the kindest thing she could have done. The normalcy of it, the expectation that I was capable, dependable, felt like an anchor. Of course, the story didn't remain confined to the courtroom. Naperville may be part of a large city, but its social circles are small. The whispers spread quickly through country clubs, law offices, and charity boards. With every retelling, the story grew larger. A courtroom showdown, a hidden fortune, a judge threatening sanctions. Elena kept me loosely informed as the rumors circulated. My father's firm, already under pressure from the malpractice lawsuit, began quietly distancing itself from him. Partnership discussions were postponed indefinitely. The vultures were circling. I never heard directly from my parents. No calls, no messages, no letters. Their silence was different now. Before, it had been a weapon. Now it felt like the quiet of a defeated army retreating from the battlefield. It had no power over me anymore. About a week after the hearing, Lucas Foster appeared at my apartment door. When I opened it, he stood there looking oddly uncomfortable. Lucas had always been the golden child, the one who effortlessly matched our parents' expectations. He worked in finance, lived in a sleek downtown condo, and dated women whose smiles were as polished as their designer handbags. We had never been close. We orbited the same family but rarely crossed paths. "Adriana," he said awkwardly, avoiding my eyes. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. He walked inside, glancing around the living room, taking in the bookshelves, the art, the comfortable warmth of the space. He looked like a tourist visiting a foreign country. "Nice place," he said, though the words sounded hollow. "What do you want, Lucas?" He finally looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine confusion in his expression. "I heard about what happened," he said. "Mom and Dad, they're a mess. There's talk about selling the house, between the legal fees and the inquiry the judge ordered. It's a lot." I didn't respond. I simply waited. He shifted uncomfortably. "They said you have some kind of collection worth a lot of money, something you never told anyone about." "That's right." "Why?" he asked suddenly. The question burst out of him with surprising urgency. "Why wouldn't you tell your family something like that?" And there it was, the core assumption our parents had always lived by. Family meant ownership, every secret, every asset, every life. For a moment I felt an unexpected flicker of pity for him. He had been built by the same system, but he had never questioned it. "Lucas," I said gently, "if I had told them, what do you think would have happened?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. The answer was obvious. "They would have taken control," I continued. "They would have told me how to manage it, who to sell it to, where to invest the money. It would have become another piece of their status." I shook my head. "It wasn't about hiding something from family. It was about it being mine, something I built on my own." I looked around the apartment. They were never interested in the real parts of my life, only the version of me that fit their expectations. I paused. The collection didn't fit their narrative, so to them, it didn't exist. Lucas sank onto the sofa, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Dad's different now," he admitted. "Still angry, but it's like the air's gone out of him. And Mom, she just cries. She keeps saying she doesn't understand what she did wrong." "She didn't see me," I said quietly. "That's what she did wrong." We sat in silence for a moment. The distance between us was still there, but for the first time, it didn't feel hostile. It simply existed. "They asked me to talk to you," Lucas admitted at last, "to see if maybe there's some way to fix things, to help them." Of course they had. Old habits don't disappear easily. Even after defeat, they had sent an emissary. "There's nothing to fix," I said calmly. "The court already settled that. They don't need my help. They need to deal with the consequences of their choices, just like I had to." Lucas nodded slowly, not quite agreement, but understanding. He was beginning to see the shape of a new reality, one where I was no longer a subordinate member of the family. I was something else entirely. "They might lose the house," he said quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied. And to my surprise, part of me meant it. Not sorrow for the loss of their status symbol, but a distant, detached sadness for the pain that comes with downfall, even when that downfall is self-inflicted. Lucas stood and moved toward the door. He paused and turned back. "That car," he said hesitantly. "The Mustang. Is it really a 65? A small, genuine smile appeared on my face. "Yeah," I said. "It is." He shook his head, looking both impressed and bewildered. "I never knew you were into cars." "There's a lot you never knew," I replied gently. He gave a quiet nod and stepped out into the hallway. When the door closed, the apartment fell silent again. His visit clarified something important for me. The battle had been won, but the landscape afterward was something I would have to navigate on my own. The family I had once known no longer existed. What remained were individuals I might one day learn to relate to in new ways, or perhaps not at all. Either way, I would face it from a place of unshakable independence. A few days later, Elena Castillo called. Her voice carried a brisk note of satisfaction. "The court's inquiry is moving quickly," she said. "Judge Mercer isn't treating this lightly." According to her, my parents were now facing substantial financial sanctions for filing the petition in bad faith. It wouldn't bankrupt them, but combined with their other legal troubles, it would force major changes to their lifestyle. "The house in Naperville is definitely going on the market," Elena added. She paused before continuing. "And Gregory Hale is under review by the State Bar Association for his role in the case." The outcome felt like justice, cold, procedural, and inevitable. It didn't bring excitement or revenge, only a quiet sense of closure. "There's one more thing," Elena said. "A reporter from the Chicago Tribune heard about the case, apparently the hidden fortune in." She hesitated. "I usually recommend declining, but this might be an opportunity to control the narrative, to tell your story on your own terms." I thought about it for a moment. Public attention made my reclusive instincts recoil, but Elena was right. My parents' version of me, the unstable daughter who couldn't manage her life, might continue circulating in whispers. This was a chance to redefine the story, not as a victim, not as some secret hoarder of wealth, but as what I actually was: an archivist, a collector, and a woman who had built a meaningful life quietly and deliberately. "I'll do it," I said. The interview took place the following Saturday at the Chicago History Museum. The reporter, Emily Park, had intelligent eyes and a calm, respectful demeanor. At first, she avoided the courtroom drama entirely. Instead, she asked about my work. I showed her the archives, rows of preserved letters, maps, and photographs. I explained the strange magic of holding a document written 2 centuries ago. We talked about how ordinary stories, letters between siblings, journals from factory workers, could illuminate entire eras of history. Her curiosity was genuine. Eventually, she circled gently toward the subject everyone was curious about. "The court documents mention a remarkable personal collection," she said carefully, "one that seems very different from the image presented in the petition." I took a breath. "My collection wasn't built as an investment strategy," I explained. "It grew naturally alongside my work. I collected pieces of history that spoke to me, documents that deserved to be preserved. The financial value came later. It was the result of patience and care." I paused before continuing. "My parents saw the world primarily through status and transactions. They struggled to understand that something could be both personally meaningful and financially valuable." Emily nodded thoughtfully, writing notes. "So what comes next for Adriana Foster?" I looked around the quiet archive room, at the shelves holding centuries of forgotten voices. "The same thing as before," I said honestly. "My work, my home, my life." I smiled slightly, just with a little less noise. The article appeared the following week. The headline read, "The Archivist's Fortune, Silence, Secrets, and Self-Made Security." It was thoughtful and fair. The piece portrayed me as a dedicated historian and careful collector, framing the courtroom battle as a collision between outdated control and modern independence. For the first time, my version of the story existed publicly. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took the Mustang out. I had no destination in mind. I simply drove. The engine's deep, steady rumble felt like a living reminder of my own quiet resilience. I left the city behind and followed winding country roads, sunlight flashing across the car's long green hood. The wind tangled my hair. For the first time in a long while, I realized something important. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I was free. I had reclaimed my life, not just in a courtroom, but within myself. The little girl who once hid in a closet to cry had finally come home. Winning a war doesn't mean the ground stops shifting. In the weeks that followed, the effects of the courtroom battle reached further than I expected. The article had been like dropping a stone into still water. Ripples spread outward in unexpected directions. The first ripple was professional. Emails began arriving, not from journalists, but from universities, museums, and historical foundations. The article had mentioned my focus on local industrial history. A professor from a state university asked if I would collaborate on a digital archive project. The director of a railroad museum wondered if my collection included early train survey documents. Suddenly, my expertise, once known only to Margaret Holloway and a handful of dedicated researchers, had become public knowledge. I wasn't just Adriana, the quiet archivist. I was Adriana Foster, collector and scholar. The recognition was both exhilarating and terrifying. I agreed to participate in the digital exhibit. It felt like the natural next step in the life I had built. The second ripple was more personal and far more complicated. It arrived as a message on a professional networking site from a woman named Sophie Langford. Dear Miss Foster, I read the recent article about you with great interest. My aunt, Eleanor Briggs, worked as Gregory Hale's legal secretary for 20 years before retiring last year. She believes there are things you should know about your father's firm and the circumstances surrounding your case. If you're willing to listen, she's willing to speak. My heart thudded slowly. Gregory Hale's secretary. This ripple had come from deep inside the opposing camp. I discussed the message with Elena, her eyes lit with sharp interest. This could be extremely important for the court's inquiry, she said. It might reveal exactly what they were thinking when they filed that petition. She leaned forward. Proceed carefully. Meet in a public place. If you'd like, I'll have someone nearby. A few days later, I met Sophie and her aunt Eleanor Briggs at a quiet tea shop in a neutral part of the city. Eleanor was in her late 60s, with clear, intelligent eyes, and the straightforward demeanor of someone who had spent decades watching lawyers at work. She didn't waste time. I worked for Gregory Hale since he was a junior partner, Eleanor Briggs said, her voice calm but steady. For a long time I respected him. But in the last few years things changed at the firm. The pressure became overwhelming. Your father's practice was extremely aggressive. She folded her hands around her teacup. When that malpractice lawsuit was filed, the panic inside the office was obvious. Gregory was desperate to keep his oldest friend and partner afloat. She took a small sip of tea before continuing. About 2 months before the conservatorship petition was filed, I walked into Gregory's office with some paperwork. The door was slightly open. Your father was there with him. Her voice dropped slightly. I heard your father say, there has to be something we can leverage. She's always been the weak link emotionally. We can frame it as concern. I felt my stomach tighten. Eleanor continued. Gregory replied, It's risky, Patrick. If she fights, she shook her head. Your father cut him off. He said, she won't fight. She never fights. She'll fold. And once we have conservatorship, we can liquidate quietly. It'll be enough to settle the lawsuit and refinance everything. We just need the court to see her our way. The words hung between us in the quiet tea shop, ugly, precise. It was confirmation of something I had already suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. This hadn't been vague greed or controlling instincts. It had been a plan, a calculated strategy. They had seen me as their financial escape route. My supposed weakness had been the cornerstone of their scheme. Eleanor looked at me with deep sympathy. I'm sorry, dear. When I read that article and realized how wrong they were about you, I couldn't stay silent. I've already given a statement to the Bar Association investigator, but I thought you deserved to hear it directly. She paused. You weren't just misunderstood as a daughter. You were targeted. My throat tightened as I thanked her. Her words were painful, but they were also a kind of closure. The timing finally made sense. The malpractice lawsuit had started the clock ticking, and I had been the emergency fund they believed they could access with a legal hammer. The third ripple came from Lucas again. This time he didn't show up at my apartment. He called. Adriana, he said, sounding strained. I've been digging through my own finances and the family stuff. Dad had me co-sign on some loans a while back. I never really looked at them. I just signed where he told me. He let out a shaky breath. I'm in trouble. Not like them, but it's messy. And the truth is, I have no idea how to deal with it. The golden child had finally discovered the thin layer beneath the polish. For the first time in his life, he was confronting the consequences of simply trusting our parents' judgment. I'm not asking for money, he added quickly. Nothing like that, but how did you learn to manage everything yourself? The question caught me off guard. There was no arrogance in his voice, no entitlement, just uncertainty. He wasn't asking for rescue, he was asking for direction. For starters, I said gently, you look at the numbers, all of them, even the ones that scare you. I could almost hear him nodding through the phone. Get a notebook, I continued. Write down every debt, every asset, every monthly expense. Stop signing anything you don't fully understand. Then you build a plan, one step at a time. It's not magic, it's attention. We talked for nearly an hour. I recommended a few trustworthy, fee-only financial advisors and showed him some budgeting tools. I didn't solve his problems, but I gave him the tools to start solving them himself. At the end of the call, he went quiet. Thank you, Adriana, he said finally. Then after a pause, I'm sorry for everything. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, just the first fragile plank of a bridge stretched across years of distance. Whether it would hold, I didn't know, but it existed. The final ripple was internal, and it was the deepest of all. Once the courtroom battle ended and the adrenaline faded, something else surfaced. Grief. Not for the parents I had, but for the parents I never did. The ones who would have been proud of my collection, who might have helped me restore the Mustang, who would have seen my quiet life as something to celebrate instead of something to fix. That loss, the loss of a dream I had carried since childhood, finally hit me, and I let it. One evening I sat alone in my apartment and cried. Not for what they had done, but for what they could never be. Strangely, the tears felt cleansing. I was mourning something that had never truly existed, and once mourned, it lost the power to haunt me. The space it left behind wasn't empty. It was open. Open for my own choices, my own relationships, my own definition of family. A few nights later, Margaret Holloway invited me over for dinner. Not as my boss, as a friend. Her house was cluttered and warm, filled with cats, books, and the smell of roasted chicken. We ate, talked about work, history, and small everyday things. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just life. When I was leaving, she hugged me quickly and fiercely. You did good, kid, she muttered. Now go live your life. Then she added with a grin, and for heaven's sake, bring that Mustang by sometime. I want a ride. I laughed. Driving home that night, the city lights reflected across the windshield. I realized something. The ripples from that courtroom weren't just disturbances. They were the world rearranging itself around the truth of who I was. I was no longer the invisible daughter, no longer the quiet victim. I was a person with a reputation, a profession, a complicated history, and a life that I had built piece by piece. The ripples would continue. But now I was the stone at the center of the water, steady, present, just beginning to understand what that meant. Peace, I realized, isn't something that simply arrives. It's something you build, like a house. And with the rubble of the past finally cleared away, I now had the space to lay the foundation for whatever came next. Not for defense, but for a life that was truly my own. The first brick in that life was my home. For 5 years, my apartment had been a sanctuary, but it had also carried the quiet tension of a fortress, a place designed more for retreat than for living. I decided to change that. Nothing dramatic. I didn't sell it or move away. Instead, I made it more mine. I finally hung the large framed antique map of Chicago that I had bought years earlier but never dared display, always worrying it might seem too bold. I bought a new armchair, deep, comfortable, meant for reading instead of worrying. On the kitchen windowsill, I started a small herb garden. They were small changes, but each one felt like a declaration. I am staying. I am thriving here. The second brick was my work, which began to grow in unexpected ways. The collaboration with the University of Chicago on the digital exhibit Voices from the Furnace, the human stories of industrial growth, opened an entirely new dimension for me. My archival work was no longer limited to preservation. I was curating history. Letters from factory workers, engineering sketches, newspaper clippings, all woven together into a narrative larger than any single document. During one planning meeting, Dr. Evans leaned back thoughtfully. Your instinct for connecting these materials is remarkable, Adriana, he said. You see relationships most people miss. It was a different kind of validation. Professional, earned, and it meant more than any forced praise my parents had ever given. The third brick was the most surprising: community. The newspaper article and the courtroom drama had created an unexpected ripple. Volunteers and colleagues at the Chicago History Museum began speaking to me differently, not with curiosity or gossip, but with respect. Some even confided their own family struggles to me. In a quiet way, I had become someone people saw as strong. It wasn't a role I had ever imagined for myself. But I didn't shrink from it. I listened. I offered understanding when I could. And in doing that, I discovered something unexpected. I felt less alone. Then there was Lucas. Our fragile bridge held. He followed my advice, hired one of the financial advisors I had recommended, and began slowly untangling himself from the financial obligations our parents had placed on him. Every few weeks he would call, not to ask for help but to report progress. I sold the condo, he told me one evening. His voice sounded tired but steady. It was too much. I'm renting a smaller place now, closer to work. There was no bitterness in his voice, just acceptance. Hard lessons were teaching him resilience and humbling him in ways that made him almost likable. He never asked directly about our parents, and I never volunteered information. But one day he mentioned something casually. Mom called. And? She asked if I'd talk to you. I waited. I told her yes, he said. She just said, oh. Then she changed the subject. It was a small exchange, but it spoke volumes. In their world, the topic of me had become a closed door. They had locked it. But I was the one who had thrown away the key. Elena's work eventually reached its conclusion. The court's investigation determined that the conservatorship petition had indeed been filed in bad faith. My parents were ordered to pay a substantial portion of my legal fees along with an additional fine imposed by the court. It didn't destroy them financially, but it added another heavy weight to a balance already tipping against them. The disciplinary review of Gregory Hale was still pending, but Elena told me his reputation had suffered severe damage. The legal community, it seemed, had little patience for lawyers who weaponized the court system against family members. Justice, quiet, procedural, and meticulous, had run its course. With the legal storm fading, my attention turned to the one unfinished part of my life, my collection. For years it had been my secret. Then it had become my shield. Then my revelation. Now I had to decide what it should become. I invited Dr. Evans and a curator from the Illinois State Museum, a woman named Marie, to my apartment. Opening that part of my life to professional scrutiny felt strangely vulnerable. We spent an afternoon reviewing carefully stored boxes and climate-controlled cases. Marie handled an 1880 leather-bound factory foreman's journal with reverence. "This is extraordinary," she murmured. "The daily detail alone makes it an invaluable social record." By the end of the visit, they had made a proposal, not to purchase the collection, but to house a large portion of it at the museum on long-term loan as the centerpiece of a permanent exhibit on early state industry. I would retain ownership, but the pieces would be preserved under ideal conditions, studied by historians and shared with the public. The more personal items, the diaries that felt almost like companions, I could keep. It was the perfect solution. My collection would stop being a hidden fortune. It would become a legacy, a living archive telling stories far larger than I could tell alone. I said yes. The day the movers arrived to pack the selected items felt bittersweet. I watched as boxes I had once carried home myself, with private excitement, were carefully loaded into a climate-controlled transport van. But the sadness was clean. Like the ache after meaningful work, I wasn't losing anything. I was giving it a larger life. That evening my apartment felt different, lighter. The ghosts of secrecy had disappeared. What remained was simply the present. I cooked a small dinner and ate it quietly at the kitchen table, watching the city lights glow beyond the window. The silence no longer felt like hiding. It felt like peace. A few days later, I finally did something I had been promising for weeks. I drove the Mustang to Margaret Holloway's house. She was waiting on the porch when I arrived, grinning like a child. "About time," she called out. We drove along the river parkway, the engine rumbling smoothly beneath us. When I accelerated along an open stretch of road, Margaret laughed with pure delight. "You know, Adriana," she shouted over the wind, "I always knew there was a little fire in you. I'm glad the rest of the world finally sees it." I laughed too, free and unrestrained, the sound carried away by the rushing air. She was right. The fire had always been there, carefully banked, quiet, but strong enough to keep me warm through the coldest years of my life. Now the fire was no longer hidden. It wasn't a destructive blaze. It was a steady, sustaining flame. The foundation of my life had finally been laid, built on truth, competence, and relationships I had chosen for myself. It was strong enough to carry whatever came next. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder at what might chase me, or scanning the horizon for an escape. I was simply here, standing in the present, building a life, and that was more than enough. Even the strongest foundations, however, are sometimes tested. The test came on a rainy Thursday evening about 3 months after the museum accepted the majority of my collection. Rain fell in a steady gray curtain outside my windows. The pavement shimmered under the streetlights, turning the whole city into a watercolor of reflections. I was curled in my armchair with a book, a mug of tea warming my hands. It was the kind of evening that made walls and a roof feel like luxuries. Then the building's front door buzzer rang. The sound was sharp, almost intrusive against the quiet. I frowned. No one was supposed to be visiting. Margaret always called first. Lucas texted. I set the book down and walked to the intercom. "Yes?" For a moment there was only the hollow sound of rain through the speaker. Then a voice came through, thin, strained, and horribly familiar. "Adriana, it's your mother." For a second the words didn't register. My mother. Here. Outside my building. In the rain. A cold numbness spread slowly through my chest. My finger hovered over the talk button. "Please." Her voice came again, smaller this time. "I just need to talk to you. 5 minutes." Every instinct Elena had drilled into me screamed the same answer. No, this was a boundary, the most important one. But another part of me, the part that had spent months building a new foundation out of strength rather than fear, felt something else. Curiosity. The legal avenues were closed. The money was beyond their reach. So what performance remained? 5 minutes, I said into the intercom. I buzzed her in. I unlocked my apartment door but left it closed. The barrier mattered. Through the hallway I could hear slow, hesitant footsteps climbing the stairs. She hadn't taken the elevator. Then a quiet knock. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The woman standing there barely resembled the Natalie Foster I remembered. Her cream-colored trench coat was soaked dark from the rain. Her hair clung to her face. Without makeup she looked older, much older, her features carved with exhaustion. She held a small handbag like a lifeline. She didn't try to step inside. She just stood there, shivering. "You're wet," I said, because I couldn't think of anything else. "I walked from the bus stop," she answered softly. That alone said more than any explanation could have. The Natalie Foster I knew didn't take buses. I stepped aside. "Come in, you're dripping on the hall carpet." She entered slowly. Her eyes moved around my apartment as if she were studying a museum exhibit, taking in the antique map on the wall, the new reading chair, the herbs growing by the window. Her gaze paused on the empty spaces along my bookshelves, where my collection used to sit. She said nothing. "Sit," I told her, pointing to the kitchen table. I didn't invite her into the living room. That space felt too personal. I brought a clean towel from the closet and handed it to her. She dabbed her hair mechanically. I stayed standing against the counter, arms crossed. Only a few feet separated us, but the distance felt enormous. The rain tapped steadily against the windows. Finally she spoke, staring down at the table. "We sold the house yesterday." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "The movers come next week. We're renting an apartment in Brookside." Brookside was a perfectly ordinary suburb, a long way from Naperville. I nodded once. I heard. She flinched. Your father. He's taking it hard, she continued. He stays in the study all day, the blinds closed. Then she looked up. Her eyes were full of something I had never seen before. Confusion. Genuine confusion. Adriana, she said, what happened? How did everything go so wrong? For a moment I almost laughed. Not out of humor, but disbelief. She truly didn't know. In her mind, they were still the victims. Victims of a daughter who had somehow betrayed them simply by succeeding. You came here to ask me that? I said calmly. You tried to convince a court that I was mentally incompetent so you could take control of everything I own and sell it to pay your debts. The court saw through it. That's what happened. She shook her head slowly. We were trying to help you, to protect you. You always needed guidance. I needed parents, I replied quietly. Not managers, not supervisors. Parents who actually saw me. She blinked, stunned. You never did, I continued. You saw a reflection of yourselves. And when I stopped reflecting what you wanted, you tried to break the mirror. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean path through the rainwater. We loved you. I tilted my head slightly. Did you? The question came without anger, just quiet curiosity. Or did you love the idea of a daughter you could shape? Because the woman I actually became, the one who built this life, you never loved her. You never even tried to meet her. She stared down at the damp towel twisting in her hands, and for the first time in her life, Natalie Foster had no answer. The performance was gone. What sat across from me now was something far more unsettling, raw, unscripted wreckage. It was almost harder to face than the flawless tears she had produced in the courtroom. Why are you here, Mom? I used the word deliberately, testing how it felt. It sounded strange, like a label for someone I barely knew. She took a shaky breath. I wanted to see where you live, she said quietly. I wanted to understand, and I wanted to give you this. She opened her wet handbag and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. The corners were worn with age. She slid it across the table toward me. It was my mother's, your grandmother's. She left it to me, but I always meant to give it to you someday. She hesitated. I think someday is now. I didn't reach for it. I don't want your jewelry. It's not an apology, she said quickly, almost defensively. I know it can't be. It just belongs with you, not in some storage locker. She looked down at the box. She would have liked you. Grandma Rose. She was quiet too. She loved old things. A faint, sad smile flickered across her face. She used to say I was too loud, too worried about what people thought. The irony was almost suffocating. After a moment, I reached out and opened the box. Inside lay a small silver pendant shaped like an oak leaf. Delicate, simple, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with status. It was nothing my mother would ever wear. Thank you, I said quietly, because it was the only polite response. I closed the box and placed it back on the table between us, a tiny bridge over an impossible canyon. She stood up. Her 5 minutes were clearly over. Standing there in my kitchen, damp and smaller than I had ever seen her, she looked almost fragile. I'll go, she said. She walked toward the door, then paused. Asher says you're doing well, she added. That you're happy. I am. She nodded slowly, absorbing the information like a report from a distant country. Good, she murmured. That's good. Her hand touched the doorknob. Then she turned one last time. For a brief moment, she wasn't my mother. She was simply a woman standing in front of a door she had locked herself out of. I'm sorry, alone, she whispered. And for the first time, it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a confession with no expectation of forgiveness. Then she left. Her footsteps faded slowly down the stairwell. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, the rain tapping against the windows. The velvet box remained on the kitchen table. I didn't open it again. Instead, I carried it into my bedroom and placed it inside a drawer. It wasn't a treasure. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was simply an artifact, a piece of history I no longer had to carry. The uninvited guest had come and gone. She had brought no new conflict, no manipulation, no demands, only a deep, unsettling sadness. But she hadn't shaken my foundation. If anything, the visit proved how strong it had become. I had faced the ghost of my past, listened to its confusion, and felt only distant compassion. The past had no power here anymore. I returned to my armchair, picked up my book, and took a sip of tea that had gone lukewarm. The story on the pages felt more real than the one that had just walked out my door. I was home, and for the first time in my life, I was truly at peace. Spring arrived quietly, not with a dramatic burst, but with gentle persistence. The gray rain gave way to warm sunlight, and the herbs on my windowsill glowed bright green. The city shed its winter heaviness. Life settled into a new rhythm, my rhythm. The museum exhibit, Voices from the Furnace, open to a small crowd of historians, students, and curious visitors. I stood near the back of the gallery, unnoticed, watching people move slowly between the glass cases. A young student leaned forward, studying the looping handwriting of a factory worker's diary. Nearby, an older man pointed to an engineering schematic and told his grandson, "See that bridge? That's how they built it." My collection, once a secret passion, had become something else entirely, a conversation, a connection. That was its real value. Dr. Evans found me near the doorway and squeezed my arm. "You did this," he said. I shook my head. "We did." And I meant it. My work at the Historical Society deepened. I wasn't just preserving the past anymore. I felt like part of a lineage, caretakers protecting stories that deserved to survive. Then one afternoon, Margaret Holloway announced her retirement. At the small celebration held in the archives break room, surrounded by cake and colleagues, she pulled me aside. "You're ready," she said bluntly. "I recommended you as my successor." The board agreed. She fixed me with that familiar stern look. "It's not a title they're giving you. It's a responsibility. These stories, this place, they'll be yours to protect." The weight of her words settled on me. This wasn't a promotion. It was a trust. I accepted. Lucas and I began meeting for coffee once a month. Our conversations were still careful at first, both of us learning how to exist as siblings without the shadow of our parents' expectations. He talked about budgeting, about the woman he had started seeing, about the strange relief of living within his means. He never mentioned our parents, and I never asked. We were building something new, slowly, piece by piece, fragile, but real. The court eventually finalized the sanctions against my parents. The fines and legal fees forced them into a smaller life. The financial blow, combined with the sale of their house, forced exactly the kind of lifestyle change Miranda had predicted. Through distant channels, I heard the rest of the story unfold. My father took early retirement from his firm. The malpractice lawsuit was settled quietly, draining what remained of their resources. The reputation he had spent decades building disappeared almost overnight. My parents moved into a modest apartment in Brookside. No country club, no charity galas, no carefully curated image, just quiet obscurity. The world they had built their identity upon had evaporated. I didn't feel triumph hearing any of this, only a quiet recognition of cause and effect. They had chosen a life built on control and appearance, and when the appearance cracked, there was nothing solid underneath to hold it up. One Saturday morning, I took the Mustang out for a long drive. The windows were down. Spring air rushed through the car carrying the scent of warm earth and blooming trees. I drove without a destination, just following whatever road felt right. Eventually, I found myself at a lookout point above the river valley. I turned off the engine and sat there in the quiet. Birdsong drifted through the air. Far below, the distant hum of the city rolled softly like a tide. And I thought about the road that had brought me here. The long, winding road from the girl hiding in a closet to the woman sitting in a car. She restored herself, looking out over a landscape she had chosen. That's when I realized something. The measure of a life isn't the battles you win, it's the peace you build when the noise is finally gone. It's not the fortune you accumulate, it's the meaning you create from what you have. And it's not the family you're born into, it's the connections you choose to nurture, and the ones you release with grace. My life now was measured in quieter ways, in the careful order of the archives I protected, in the steady purr of a Mustang engine on an open road, in thoughtful conversations over coffee with my brother, in the courage it took to say no to a life that was never meant for me, and the even greater courage it took to say yes to building one that was. I had entered that courtroom terrified that I would have to prove I wasn't the fragile person they claimed I was. But when I walked out, I realized something far more powerful. I didn't prove I was strong, I proved I was whole. That list the bailiff read aloud in the courtroom, the one that shocked everyone in the room, wasn't really a list of assets. It was a list of everything I had built quietly over years, my patience, my discipline, my secret joys. Every item was a silent declaration. I can. And when the judge brought his gavel down that day, it didn't just close a case, it opened the rest of my life. And that's the truth I want to leave with you. Sometimes the world tries to measure you with the wrong scale. People judge your worth by the career you choose, the lifestyle you live, or the expectations you refuse to follow. When you don't fit the role they imagined, they may call you difficult, naive, or incapable. But their labels are not your identity. For years, I believed I had to defend who I was. I thought strength meant proving them wrong. What I learned instead is that true strength isn't about arguing with those who misunderstand you. It's about quietly building a life that reflects your values, your passions, and your peace. You don't need approval to live authentically. You only need the courage to trust the voice that tells you who you are meant to be. Because in the end, freedom isn't given by a courtroom, a family, or a society. Freedom begins the moment you decide that your life belongs to you. And once you claim that truth, no one can ever take it away. And if this story spoke to something inside you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where you had to stand your ground and choose your own life, even when others doubted you? If you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and a little about your story. Reading your experiences reminds me that none of us are truly alone in these battles. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like the video and share it with someone who might need the same reminder of their strength today. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, truth, and people reclaiming their lives, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for spending this time with me and for being part of this growing community.